The sound of my shoes striking the marble floor of the courthouse echoed like gunshots in the hushed chamber, each step a reminder that I was not dead, not erased, not gone. The ache in my ribs seared with every movement, but I refused to let it show. I wanted him to see me strong. I wanted him to see the ghost he had created and failed to bury. Ethan Reynolds sat tall at the defense table, jaw set, his lawyer flipping through files with calm confidence. For a moment, his profile looked as it always had, charming, composed, practiced. Then his eyes lifted. The second they locked on me, everything inside him shattered. His face drained of blood, his lips parted, his hands froze mid-motion. He blinked twice as though the vision before him must be a trick of the mind. But I kept walking straight toward the witness stand cane. In my hand, bruises still faint on my skin, the living evidence of his betrayal. Gasps swelled in the gallery. Reporters leaned forward with pens trembling. Jurors shifted mouths open. Even the judge straightened with a look of disbelief. Ethan lurched backward as if struck his chair, scraping against the floor. Paper spilled across his lap. His breath came in ragged bursts. It looked as though the very sight of me had ripped the mask off his face. Then came the moment that cracked the silence into chaos. Vanessa Cole, his lover, seated neatly 2 rows behind him, stared at me with widening eyes, her lips trembling. She tried to steady herself, but the truth boiled out like steam from a bursting pipe. He told me she was gone. He told me she would never come back. It was all for the insurance money. Her voice sliced through the courtroom and froze every soul in the room. The jury gasped as one. The judge's gavel pounded, but the sound was drowned by Vanessa's sob that followed raw and unrestrained as she buried her face in her manicured hands. Ethan shot to his feet, his face contorted, and he grabbed her arm to silence her. But she yanked away, shouting through tears. He planned it. He planned everything. $5 million. He promised me freedom. Ethan staggered back as though the words themselves were blows. His knees buckled and he crashed against the defense table, hands gripping the edge until his knuckles turned white. His lawyer tried to steady him, whispering frantically, but Ethan's composure was gone, dissolved into the sweat dripping from his brow, the panic in his darting eyes. For the first time since our wedding, the entire room saw the truth. He was not the charming husband. He was a coward, a fraud, a predator, unmasked in public. My attorney, Mark Hayes, placed a hand on my shoulder, grounding me as adrenaline surged through my veins. This was the moment I had fought for through the endless nights in a hospital bed, through the pain that clawed at my bones, through the terror of knowing the man I loved had tried to erase me. I locked eyes with Ethan and let my voice cut across the stunned silence. You thought I would stay gone forever, but here I am. The words struck like a hammer. Ethan's shoulders collapsed inward. His face twisted into disbelief, then rage, then fear, all at once. He stumbled back into his chair, chest heaving, sweat soaking his collar. Vanessa sobbed uncontrollably, clutching her purse like a lifeline while the gallery buzzed with voices rising in shock. Reporters scribbled furiously, camera shutters clicked. Jurors leaned forward, one covering her mouth with both hands as though she might be sick. The judge hammered the gavel again, voice booming for order, but the damage was done. The courtroom had witnessed the fall. I stood there trembling, not from weakness, but from the storm of adrenaline and memory. Every scar, every bruise, every lonely night in that sterile hospital bed had led to this. The predator who believed he had silenced me forever was now trapped in the very light he had tried to extinguish. I could feel the collective gaze of the room, heavy and electric, waiting for the story behind this impossible return. My heart hammered as though trying to break free from my chest, but my voice was steady when I whispered again, almost to myself, how did it come to this? I was not born into a family that believed in love or fairness, but into a house where hierarchy ruled and appearances mattered more than truth. My name is Clara Reynolds, and from the moment I was old enough to understand words, I knew that in my parents' eyes I was second best. They had a son older than me named Daniel, who was their pride and their golden child. Every photo album was filled with his awards, his trophies, his smiling face held up as the standard of perfection. When I brought home drawings from school, they were pushed aside for his medals. When I earned a good grade, it was treated as expected background noise, while Daniel's smallest achievement was celebrated with a cake or a family dinner. I grew up shrinking into corners, learning not to demand attention because attention always belonged to someone else. My father was a man who valued control above all things. He believed in order and obedience, and when I asked questions or challenged decisions, his answer was the sharp back of his hand against the table, and the colder phrase, "Do not talk back, Clara." My mother was softer in voice, but no less cruel. She would smooth my hair and whisper, "If you want peace, do not upset your father, and do not compete with your brother." Their lesson was clear. I was to accept the place they gave me. I was to live quietly in the shadow of others. Daniel absorbed this dynamic with ease. As a boy, he stole my toys and told our parents I had given them to him, and they believed him without pause. As a teenager, he mocked my clothes, called me dull and useless in front of friends, while my parents laughed nervously and told me not to be so sensitive. At family dinners, if I tried to share a story, he would interrupt, and my parents let him because in their minds, his words carried more weight than mine. This was not just favoritism, it was systematic erasure. By the time I reached high school, I had already learned to keep my voice low to make myself invisible. Every choice I tried to make for myself was twisted. When I wanted to apply to art school, my father forbade it. When I wanted to travel with friends, my mother clutched my arm and told me that girls like me were not meant for adventures. Their voices formed the bars of a cage I carried with me long after I left their house. It was not only Daniel who defined my role. My parents themselves reinforced it daily. They praised me only when I served. When I cooked or cleaned or sacrificed my own desires for Daniel's needs, they said "good girl," as if obedience was the only trait worth rewarding. The unspoken law was submission. If Daniel was sick, I was to stay home from school and care for him. If he wanted money, I was told to lend it without question. When I dared to say no, my father would stare at me with eyes that promised punishment, and my mother would sigh that disappointed sigh that made me feel smaller than dust. These moments carved themselves into my identity. I grew into a woman who believed that my value was measured only by how much I could endure. In public, our family looked perfect. Daniel, the shining star, my parents, the proud supporters, and me, the quiet daughter who smiled in photos but said little. Behind closed doors, silence was demanded. We did not speak of bruises. We did not speak of loneliness. We did not speak of the constant fear that one wrong word would unleash an explosion. As I entered my 20s, I tried to step into independence. I rented a small apartment. I found a modest job. For the first time, I felt a fragile sense of self-forming. But even then, my parents' voices clung to me like chains. They called, often reminding me that I was not safe alone, that I needed guidance. My mother said over and over again, "You will never be enough without a man to take care of you." Those words sank deep into my bones. They laid the groundwork for the choices I would make later, for the marriage I would enter, for the trap that nearly killed me. When Ethan came into my life, polished, charming, full of promises of safety, I was primed to believe him. I had been trained since childhood to see protection not as a right, but as a gift to be earned. My family had taught me that my role was to bend to someone stronger. I could not see then that Ethan was only another version of the control I had always known. Looking back, I understand that my childhood was not simply painful, it was preparation. It conditioned me to accept the unacceptable, to stay quiet when I should have screamed to trust others more than myself. It left me vulnerable to a man who would one day see my life not as sacred, but as expendable for money. The cruelty of my family did not end when I left their house. It followed me into my marriage, shaping every decision, every silence, every wound. This was the soil from which everything else grew, and it is impossible to understand the betrayal that nearly killed me without first seeing how deep the roots of that control had sunk into me. When I first met Ethan Reynolds, I was 25 and still clinging to the idea that maybe if I found the right man, I could finally escape the weight of my family's judgment. He appeared in my life like an answer to that longing. He was handsome in a clean-cut way, with dark hair always perfectly styled and a voice that carried confidence like a weapon. He worked in finance and carried himself like someone who owned every room he entered. When he looked at me across that bar on a rainy Thursday night, he smiled as if I were the only person worth noticing. For someone who had been told all her life that she was never enough, that look felt like sunlight. In the beginning, he drowned me in attention. Flowers at my desk, surprise dinners, late-night phone calls filled with promises. He told me I was beautiful. He told me I was worth protecting. He told me that with him, I would never feel alone again. My parents adored him immediately. My mother clasped her hands and whispered, "He will take care of you, Clara." My father nodded with rare approval, calling Ethan a man with ambition. Their praise was intoxicating because for once it was directed at me, even if only through him. Within months, Ethan asked me to marry him. The proposal was staged at a restaurant with champagne and a ring that sparkled so bright I could barely breathe. I said yes because it felt like destiny, because my parents urged me, because I wanted to believe that finally I had found safe harbor. The wedding was perfect in photographs. My white dress, his tailored tuxedo, the smiles plastered across every face. But beneath the surface, something darker had already begun to take root. On our honeymoon, Ethan snapped at a waiter for bringing the wrong wine, and when I gently said it was not a big deal, he turned to me with eyes so cold I felt my stomach drop. "Do not contradict me in public," he hissed. The words were sharp, but the kiss he pressed to my forehead moments later was softer than silk. I told myself it was stress. I told myself every couple argues. Yet the seed of fear had been planted. As weeks turned into months, the mask slipped further. Ethan wanted to know where I was at every hour. He asked for my phone passwords. He criticized the way I dressed the friends I spoke to, even the meals I cooked. If I protested, he would laugh and say I was too sensitive. If I pressed further, his laughter would harden into anger. The first time he hit me, it was with an open hand across my cheek, after I questioned why he came home at 2 a.m. The sting burned my skin. The shock stole my voice. He apologized an hour later with tears in his eyes and a bouquet of lilies. He said he had been under pressure. He said it would never happen again. My mother, when she saw the faint mark on my cheek, told me, "Marriage is hard, Clara. Do not make a scene." My father simply said, "Do not provoke him." Their silence, their dismissal reinforced the cage I was trapped in. Ethan learned quickly that my family would not protect me. That knowledge made him bolder. The slaps turned to fists against my ribs. The insults turned to hours of cold silence designed to break me. He monitored my bank account, persuaded me to quit my job, insisting it was for my own good. Soon, every dollar I spent came from his approval. I became a shadow in my own home, cooking, cleaning, smiling when he demanded it, and shrinking when his temper flared. Yet there were moments of twisted tenderness. He would bring me jewelry after a particularly vicious fight. He would stroke my hair as I cried and whisper, "You know I love you, Clara." Those contradictions kept me bound. Each time I thought of leaving, I remembered my mother's voice telling me I was nothing without a man. Each time I considered telling someone I feared they would say I was exaggerating. My few friends drifted away because Ethan disliked them, and I had learned that defying him brought punishment. Slowly my world narrowed until it was only him, his rules, his moods. But deep inside, a small flame of resistance still lived. I took secret walks when he was at work, telling myself I was free for those few minutes. I hid a little cash in an envelope tucked inside an old book, though he later found it and mocked me for trying. I thought perhaps this was my fate, a lifetime of control and quiet suffering. What I could not see then was that Ethan was already building towards something darker, something final. He had discovered a way to profit not just from my obedience, but from my disappearance. And he would stop at nothing to make that plan a reality. The shift began with a conversation that seemed harmless at first, a lazy Sunday afternoon when Ethan sat across from me at the kitchen table. His tie loosened after church, his eyes bright with an excitement I had not seen in weeks. He spoke of responsibility, of building a secure future, of planning for the unexpected. He slid a folder across the table, and inside was an application for a life insurance policy worth $5 million. At first, I laughed because the number seemed absurd. We lived in a modest house. He had a decent salary, but nothing that matched that scale. He told me it was standard for people in his field, that colleagues of his had even larger policies, that it was an investment in peace of mind. He leaned close and took my hand, squeezing it with just enough pressure to remind me of his control. "This is for us, Clara," he said softly. "For our family. If anything ever happened, you would be safe." My stomach twisted, but I forced a smile. Something about it felt wrong, but my entire life had taught me to swallow my instincts. My mother's voice echoed in my head, telling me not to ruin a good thing. When I hesitated, Ethan's charm darkened into irritation. He reminded me of how much he provided, how he had taken me in, how ungrateful I would seem if I did not sign. When I still faltered, he played his final card. He invited my parents over for dinner. That night, he explained the policy to them as if he were offering me the world. My mother clasped her hands and said, "What a thoughtful husband!" My father nodded, declaring it a wise choice, and both turned to me with expectation. Their approval was suffocating their voices, a chorus drowning out my doubt. I signed my name on the line, my hand trembling, and Ethan's smile returned wide and victorious. In that moment, I did not know I had sealed my own fate. After the paperwork was complete, Ethan grew colder. The flowers stopped, the apologies faded, and his absences grew longer. I caught him texting someone late at night. His expression shuddered when I asked who it was. He told me not to snoop his words sharp enough to cut. A week later, I found a receipt for an expensive bracelet hidden in his drawer, something he had never given me. The suspicion that had gnawed at me hardened into certainty. There was another woman. But what I did not yet grasp was that she was not just a distraction, she was part of his plan. As weeks passed, his temper grew unpredictable. He told me more than once that I was a burden, that he deserved more, that women like me were replaceable. Each insult landed heavier because I could not shake the image of that signature on the insurance papers. It was as though I had written permission for him to erase me. My sleep grew restless, my chest tightened with dread, and every time I rode in the car with him, I wondered if this would be the drive where something happened. I tried to tell myself I was being paranoid, that no man could plot something so monstrous. But deep down, I knew Ethan was capable of anything if money was involved. The day he convinced me to go on a weekend trip with him was the day everything shifted toward disaster. He smiled as he packed the car, kissed my cheek as though we were still newlyweds, but his eyes carried a glint that sent a chill through me. At the time, I thought perhaps he wanted to mend things, to play at reconciliation. I clung to that fragile hope as we drove away from the city. In reality, he was driving me straight into the heart of his design, a design built on greed, betrayal, and the belief that I would never have the strength to resist. The trip began like a picture of reconciliation, the sky painted with soft clouds, Ethan driving with the radio humming faintly, his hand resting lightly on the gear shift as if nothing between us was broken. I tried to believe the act, tried to convince myself he was making an effort, that perhaps the harsh words and bruises could be set aside if only we both tried. Yet underneath the calm veneer, a knot of dread twisted tighter with every passing mile. He had chosen a route that wound through forested hills far from traffic, and I noticed how few cars appeared in either direction. When I asked where exactly we were headed, he smiled, but his eyes remained on the road, saying only a surprise getaway. My pulse quickened, and I pressed my palms against my thighs to stop the trembling. As the sun slipped lower, the two-lane road curved sharply along the edge of a ravine. That was when I saw his knuckles whiten around the wheel and felt the sudden surge of speed. The engine roared as if he had pressed the pedal through the floor. I clutched the seatbelt strap and cried out his name. He did not look at me. The car veered toward the guardrail, metal scraping against metal with a scream that split the air. My shoulder slammed into the door, pain lancing through my ribs. I gasped for breath, confusion and terror colliding. He yanked the wheel again, and the car spun the world a blur of trees and sky. Then, with chilling calm, he released the wheel and turned his head toward me. His eyes were void of warmth, cold as glass. The words he spoke were almost a whisper, but they burned into my memory. "This is better for both of us." The impact came an instant later. The car crashed through the weakened guardrail and rolled down the embankment. Glass shattered around me like rain. Metal crushed inward with sickening groans. My head snapped forward and the taste of blood filled my mouth. My leg twisted under the seat with a pain so sharp it stole my voice. When the vehicle finally jolted to a halt against a tree, I was half-conscious, vision blurring. Through the haze, I saw Ethan's door open easily. He crawled out unscathed except for a smear of blood on his forehead. He stood over the wreckage, and for a heartbeat I thought he would help me. Instead, he stared down at me with that same cold gaze. He turned, climbed up the slope, and vanished into the shadows of the trees. My heart pounded with betrayal so deep it eclipsed the pain. He had left me to die. Smoke curled from the engine, acrid and choking. I tried to move, but agony shot through my chest and leg. My hands scrabbled against the shattered glass, and blood streaked my fingers. Darkness pressed in, and I wondered if this was the end, if my story would close here with no one ever knowing the truth. Then headlights flared at the top of the road. A passing truck slowed, horn blaring, and figures scrambled down the embankment shouting. Strong arms pulled me from the wreck just as flames licked the hood. Sirens wailed in the distance, the world dissolving into noise and light before everything went black. When I woke again, it was to the sterile brightness of a hospital room, the steady beep of machines, the weight of bandages on my body. Nurses' hovered voices hushed. One told me gently that I had been unconscious for 2 days, that I had multiple broken ribs, a fractured leg, deep bruising, a concussion. I asked about Ethan, but the nurse glanced away and said he had not been seen. Later, I overheard 2 staff whispering in the hallway. They said my husband had told authorities I died on impact. They said he had already contacted the insurance company. I lay in that bed with disbelief crushing me. The man I had trusted, the man my family adored, had not only tried to kill me, but had declared me dead before my heart had even stopped beating. The realization hollowed me, left me trembling with rage and terror. Alone in that hospital room with machines keeping rhythm for my broken body, I understood that Ethan's betrayal was not impulsive. It was calculated, cold-blooded, and final. He had planned this night as the last chapter of my life and walked away certain the flames would erase me. But I was still alive, and survival meant one thing. His plan was not finished. The war he had started was only beginning. The days that followed blurred into a haze of pain and confusion. I drifted between consciousness and sleep, tethered to machines that kept my body alive while my mind tried to process the enormity of what had happened. At first, I told myself Ethan had panicked, that perhaps he had lied to the authorities out of fear or shock. But as hours turned into days and he never came, as no flowers appeared, as no familiar footsteps entered my room, the truth grew heavier. One evening, as the sun dipped beyond the blinds, a nurse named Linda adjusted my IV and glanced at me with something unspoken in her eyes. I asked softly if anyone had visited. She hesitated, then shook her head. Only once she admitted a woman with blonde hair who stood at the nurse's station asking for medical files but never stepped into my room. She said her name was Vanessa. My stomach knotted as though I had been struck. Ethan had not come to see if I was alive. His mistress had come only to gather papers. My family, when the hospital staff called the emergency numbers, had not arrived either. My parents sent a text after a week, only 4 words that seared into me like acid. Hope you are resting. No visit. No comfort. Just a message as cold as stone. It was as if the entire world had conspired to declare me already gone. Bills began to arrive even as I lay immobile. When I tried to pay one with my debit card, it was declined. I called the bank in a shaky voice, but after a maze of transfers, a representative told me my accounts were frozen due to a legal inquiry. He could not or would not say more. I felt the ground vanish beneath me, my independence fragile as it had always been dissolved. Lying in that hospital bed, unable to walk, unable to access money abandoned by the man who had sworn vows to me, and by parents who had always chosen silence, I felt erased. At night, when the pain medication dulled and the monitors hummed softly, I replayed the crash, the sudden acceleration, the deliberate way Ethan had turned the wheel, the cold words before the impact. This had not been panic. This had not been a mistake. It was choreography. It was murder dressed as tragedy. The thought should have broken me, but instead, it began to harden into resolve. The confirmation came days later through whispers from my oldest friend Maggie, who managed to find me after a nurse quietly bent rules to let her visit. She clasped my hand, her face pale with shock at the sight of my injuries, and told me she had overheard Ethan and Vanessa at a coffee shop. Vanessa had bragged that everything was about to go her way, that soon money would be pouring in. When Maggie pressed, Vanessa smirked and said, "Clara is out of the picture. He promised me it is handled." My chest tightened with fury so sharp I had to fight for breath. Maggie looked at me with tears brimming, whispering that she believed Ethan had not only tried to kill me, but was already spending the money in his head. My hands shook not from weakness, but from rage. The confirmation of betrayal gave me clarity. It was not paranoia. It was not exaggeration. It was truth. I remembered how Ethan had insisted on the insurance policy, how he had smiled when I signed, how he had turned away from the wreck without a backward glance. He had built every step of this. He had calculated my disappearance as though I were nothing more than a number on a balance sheet. And my parents in their silence had become accomplices by neglect. They did not come. They did not call beyond that hollow text. They let me drift alone as if my survival was an inconvenience. In that abandonment, I felt something inside me change. The fear that had shackled me all my life began to burn away, replaced by a cold determination. If Ethan thought I was powerless, if he thought my family's silence had sealed my erasure, he was wrong. I was still alive, and I would not let him finish the job. That night, staring at the ceiling tiles, pain radiating through every bone, I made a vow to myself. I would survive, not just to breathe, not just to exist, but to expose him, to stand one day where he would least expect me and shatter the illusion he had built. My story would not end as a victim. It would end with justice carved into stone. The turning point came with the arrival of Mark Hayes, a lawyer I had once hired briefly to review a lease. I still had his card tucked into my wallet when I was admitted to the hospital, and when Maggie asked if there was anyone trustworthy I could call his name slipped from my lips. Mark entered my hospital room one morning with a leather briefcase and a calm expression, but when he sat beside my bed, his voice carried the weight of urgency. He told me he had learned of documents filed in court papers signed by Ethan claiming that I was deceased, supported by a forged death certificate. My bank accounts had been frozen on that basis. He explained that Ethan had already initiated the claim on the $5 million policy. I listened with my chest burning each word, confirming the enormity of the betrayal. Mark leaned closer and said, "Clara, this is fraud, layered on fraud. We can fight it, but we need evidence." My pulse steadied in that moment, anger crystallizing into purpose. For weeks I had lain in that bed feeling powerless, but now there was a path. I told him about Linda the nurse, about Maggie's discovery, about Vanessa's presence at the hospital. He nodded and wrote everything down with meticulous care. Then he suggested what I had not dared imagine: we could set a trap. He arranged for a small camera to be placed discreetly in my hospital room with the help of sympathetic staff. He advised me to bait Ethan into visiting, to confront him enough that his arrogance might spill into words, damning him. I agreed, though fear twisted in my gut. I had spent years shrinking under Ethan's temper, but now I would have to provoke him. That night, Maggie used her phone to send Vanessa a message hinting that I was awake and remembering details. Within 2 days, Ethan appeared, his polished shoes clicking against the tile as he entered with a bouquet of roses clutched in his hand. He wore the mask of a grieving husband reborn into devotion, his smile practiced, but his eyes scanning the monitors with calculation. He set the flowers down without glancing at them and asked how I felt. His voice was syrup, but beneath it, I heard steel. I told him I knew what he had done, that I remembered the crash, that I remembered his words before he walked away. For a flicker of a second, his mask cracked, then reformed. He laughed softly and said, "Clara, trauma makes people imagine things. You need rest, not rumors." I pressed harder, asking about the insurance policy, about Vanessa. His smile vanished. He stepped closer, his hand gripping the rail of my bed, his voice a low growl. "You were supposed to stay gone. Do you understand? That money was meant to build a future. You ruin everything." My heart hammered, but I kept my face steady, praying the camera was capturing it all. His words dripped with contempt, every syllable proof of his intent. After a tense silence, he leaned back, smoothed his jacket, and forced a smile again. He told me to get well, kissed my forehead with mock tenderness, and walked out, leaving the flowers wilting on the table. As soon as the door closed, I gasped and called for Linda. She retrieved the footage and delivered it to Mark. When he viewed it, his face hardened with grim satisfaction. "This is enough to bring him down," he said, "but let us give him more rope." Meanwhile, Maggie continued her role, befriending Vanessa, pretending sympathy. Vanessa, careless in her arrogance, began to brag more openly. One night, she admitted over coffee that Ethan had promised her the insurance money that once I was gone, they would start fresh. Maggie recorded every word. Piece by piece, the case was building. I was no longer the silenced wife, but the architect of his undoing. In those weeks, my body healed slowly, but my spirit transformed quickly. The fear that once ruled me was replaced with strategy. I stopped thinking only of survival and started planning victory. Every night, I envisioned the moment Ethan would be forced to face me in court, the moment he would realize that the woman he thought erased had been writing the script of his downfall. When Ethan returned to the hospital a second time, the air in the room seemed to thicken. I had expected him after Maggie's staged hint that lawyers were involved and that I might be preparing statements. He entered with the same false warmth, but his stride was sharper and his jaw clenched. He carried no flowers this time, only a folder he dropped on the bedside table with a heavy thud. His voice was smooth, but his eyes glimmered with menace. "Clara, we can end this quietly," he said. "Sign these papers and you will not have to worry about anything again." I asked him what they were, though I already knew. He told me it was documentation transferring control of assets to him so he could manage everything while I recovered. My hand hovered over the folder, but I did not open it. Instead, I looked him in the eye and asked softly, "Was the $5 million worth my life?" His composure cracked. His face tightened and he sneered. "You never understood value, Clara. You were always weak, replaceable." My ribs ached from the force of my heartbeat, but I steadied my breath. I told him I remembered the crash, remembered his eyes as he walked away, remembered the words, "You were supposed to stay gone." His mask shattered, then anger flashing like lightning. He leaned so close I could feel his breath. "You should have died," he spat. "You should have made it easy." For a moment, I thought he might strike me even here surrounded by machines, but then he straightened his face paling when he realized what he had admitted aloud. I turned my head slightly toward the clock on the wall, as though I were bored knowing the camera hidden behind it had captured every word. Ethan swallowed hard, his bravado flickering. He adjusted his tie and muttered something about me being delusional. Then he stormed out, his footsteps echoing down the hall. As the door shut, my body trembled not just from fear, but from triumph. We had the confession we needed. Still, Mark insisted we gather more. The strategy was simple. Ethan's arrogance would push him further, and Vanessa's loose tongue would do the rest. Maggie met Vanessa again under the guise of friendship. This time, Vanessa's nerves were visible. She stirred her coffee with a shaking spoon, whispering that Ethan was losing control, that he was desperate for the insurance payout. Maggie prodded gently, and Vanessa admitted she had been promised part of the money. If she kept quiet, that Ethan said his wife was too broken to fight back. Maggie recorded every word once again. When I listened to the audio later, I felt a strange mix of fury and vindication. The woman he had chosen over me, the one who thought she would benefit from my death, was now a liability unraveling his scheme. Days later, Vanessa came to the hospital unannounced. She entered my room alone, her face pale, her eyes darting nervously. She closed the door and whispered that Ethan was planning to pressure me further, that if I did not sign the documents, he might try something again. Her hands trembled as she spoke. She looked less like the confident mistress and more like someone who finally understood the depth of the monster she had allied with. I listened without pity, letting her words hang in the air. She finally blurted, "I did not know he would go this far. He said it would be simple. He said you were already gone." I held her gaze and said quietly, "You helped him." She flinched as if struck, tears filling her eyes. She begged me not to reveal her involvement, said she would testify if needed. I told her it was too late for bargains. When she left, she looked shattered. That night, I stared at the ceiling and realized the balance had shifted. I was no longer the prey. The net was tightening around Ethan and Vanessa both. Soon, we would not need hidden cameras or whispered confessions. Soon, the entire world would see the truth. The court date was set. Mark told me to prepare myself because the impact would be explosive. I lay in that bed rehearsing every word, every look, every step I would take into that courtroom. I imagined the moment Ethan's world collapsed, the way his face would break when he saw me alive, the silence of the jury before they delivered their judgment. I held on to that vision like a lifeline. It was not just revenge. It was justice raw and public. The morning of the court hearing arrived cold and gray, the kind of day where the air itself felt charged with anticipation. Mark had spent hours with me preparing every detail, arranging the order of evidence, rehearsing the statements that would slice through Ethan's defense. I dressed carefully in a simple black dress that hung loose over my healing ribs, my cane in hand, determination in my eyes. As I approached the courthouse, the murmur of voices swelled. Reporters clustered outside, snapping photographs, the scent of rain on concrete, sharp in the air. Inside the chamber, people filled every row, their whispers buzzing with speculation. Ethan sat at the defense table, his hair slicked back, his suit crisp, the mask of confidence restored but fragile. Vanessa sat behind him, her hands clenched tightly in her lap, eyes darting nervously. When I entered, the murmurs died like a flame smothered by wind. Jurors straightened. The judge paused. Ethan's head jerked up, and the moment his eyes met mine, his composure cracked. He froze, lips parting, shoulders slumping as though the ghost he had created now stood to testify. A ripple of shock passed through the room. The bailiff called for order, the gavel struck, and the trial began. Mark's opening statement was steady, each word deliberate. He laid out the chain of events, the life insurance policy signed under pressure, the staged accident, the abandonment, the forged death certificate, the fraudulent insurance claim. His tone never wavered, but the weight of his words made the jury lean forward, their expressions tightening. Ethan's attorney objected often, but the judge overruled most challenges, allowing Mark to proceed. Then the evidence began. First came the video from my hospital room. The screen lit up with Ethan's image leaning over my bed. His voice caught clearly by the hidden microphone, "You were supposed to stay gone." The words echoed in the chamber, heavy and undeniable. Gasps erupted from the gallery. Ethan shifted in his seat, his face paling, his hands clenching the table. Next, Mark presented the audio recording from Vanessa, her own voice admitting that Ethan had promised her the money once I was gone. Vanessa sat frozen, her lips trembling, eyes wide as the jury turned to look at her. Tears welled as she covered her face, her composure dissolving. Ethan leaned toward her, angrily whispering, but she shook her head violently as if to reject him. Then came the forged documents, the death certificate declaring me deceased, the petition for guardianship over my assets, the attempted transfer of property into his name. Each page was displayed for the jury, each signature dissected by an expert who confirmed the forgeries. The chain of fraud was undeniable, the timeline precise. Finally, the private investigator testified, recounting Ethan's meetings with suspicious associates, the unexplained cash withdrawal, the damaged black truck seen near the hospital. Every piece of the puzzle locked into place, forming a picture of cold calculation. Ethan tried to maintain composure, but his jaw twitched. Sweat beaded his forehead. His eyes darted as if seeking escape. When it was my turn to take the stand, I felt my pulse pounding. But I stood tall, gripping my cane, facing the jury with clear eyes. I spoke of the marriage, of the first slap of the growing control of the night on the ravine road, when he whispered, "This is better for both of us." My voice cracked once, but I steadied it, refusing to be silenced. I described waking in the hospital alone, hearing that my family had abandoned me, realizing that my husband had erased me with ink on paper. I told them about the vow I had made under those sterile lights, the vow that I would not let him win. The courtroom was silent except for my words. Ethan's attorney tried to paint me as delusional, suggesting trauma had warped my memory, but Mark responded with the recordings, the documents, the testimony of witnesses. Each denial from Ethan crumbled against the mountain of evidence. The climax came when Vanessa, summoned to testify, broke entirely. Her hands shook. Her voice faltered, but finally she admitted in front of everyone that Ethan had promised her a future funded by my death. She sobbed, saying she had been blinded, that she had not believed he would truly go so far. Her words drove the final nail. Ethan slumped in his chair, face gray, his hands trembling as he buried his head in them. For the first time, the predator looked pitiful. The mask shattered his arrogance, gone. The judge recessed briefly, but the verdict was already clear in the eyes of the jury. When the ruling was delivered, finding Ethan guilty of fraud, forgery, conspiracy, and attempted murder, the room erupted. The bailiff moved to cuff him, and as he was led past me, he glanced up, his eyes wide, with something that looked very much like fear. I held his gaze steadily, feeling the power that had once been stripped from me, now restored in front of all who mattered. When the verdict was spoken aloud, the sound seemed to echo through every corner of the courthouse, like a bell tolling the end of a long nightmare. Ethan Reynolds was found guilty on every count: fraud, forgery, conspiracy, attempted murder. The judge's words carried the weight of finality. Ethan's face crumpled, his body sagged as the bailiff snapped cold steel around his wrists. For the first time, I saw the fear he had once instilled in me reflected in his own eyes. He was no longer the man who dictated what I wore, where I went, how I lived. He was a prisoner, stripped of control, carried away in disgrace. Vanessa sat trembling in the gallery, her once perfect posture destroyed, mascara streaking her cheeks. She had confessed, and in doing so condemned herself, though her cooperation earned her a lighter sentence. The sound of the gavel dismissing the court marked the beginning of my freedom. As I walked out, supported by my cane, the crowd parted, reporters shouted questions, flashbulbs burst, but all I felt was the crisp air of liberation against my face. In the days that followed, the consequences rippled outward. Ethan's conviction made headlines across the state, the story of the husband who tried to kill his wife for a $5 million insurance payout captivating every news cycle. His reputation collapsed, his business dealings unraveled, and those who once called him friend recoiled in disgust. Vanessa disappeared into obscurity, carrying the stain of her betrayal wherever she went. My parents tried to reach me only once, a short phone call filled with excuses and half-hearted claims that they had not understood the situation. I listened in silence before hanging up. Their neglect in my darkest hour had been a betrayal almost as deep as Ethan's violence. I cut ties completely, refusing to let their silence define me anymore. For the first time in my life, I felt no guilt in closing a door. With Mark's guidance, my accounts were restored. The forged documents destroyed the title to my property, returned fully in my name. The insurance company, humiliated by the near fraud, issued a statement confirming my rightful ownership of the policy. $5 million that had once been the motive for my murder now became the resource that secured my independence. But it was not triumph in the way I once imagined. There was no joy in watching Ethan led away in cuffs, no satisfaction in Vanessa's collapse. What I felt was relief, deep and quiet, like exhaling after being held underwater too long. The money itself became less important than the freedom it represented. I hired a financial advisor who specialized in ethical investments and set aside a portion for organizations that helped victims of domestic violence. Women who, like me, had been told they were powerless until they discovered they were not. Writing those checks felt like reclaiming more than finances. It was reclaiming my voice. I moved into a new house, one filled with sunlight that streamed through wide windows, a house where silence meant peace instead of punishment. Each morning, I brewed coffee without glancing over my shoulder. Each night, I locked the door knowing no one else held a key. Maggie remained at my side, our friendship deepened by the fire we had walked through together. Linda, the nurse who first told me the truth, visited occasionally, her smile reminding me that kindness had been the first thread pulling me back to life. Healing was not linear. Some nights I woke gasping, the memory of the crash burning fresh, the echo of Ethan's words haunting my dreams. Some days I caught myself expecting a sharp voice, a slammed door, a hand raised in anger. But slowly, those echoes faded. Therapy helped, journaling helped, and most of all, the knowledge that I had faced him, that I had not remained silent, helped. Standing in that courtroom had been more than testimony. It had been rebirth. I learned that survival was not simply about breathing, but about living on my own terms. I promised myself that my life from here would not be shaped by fear, not by my parents' control, not by Ethan's violence, not by anyone else's expectations. One evening, as I sat on the porch of my new home with the sun setting in streaks of gold, I thought about the woman I had been, the wife who believed obedience would protect her, the daughter who thought silence was survival. That woman had nearly been erased, but she had also given birth to the woman I was now, a woman who had stared betrayal in the face and refused to bow. The message burned in me clear and unwavering. Family can wound as deeply as any stranger. Love can be twisted into a weapon. But survival and justice are possible when you refuse to accept erasure. To anyone who has been silenced, underestimated, or nearly destroyed, know this: you are not powerless. Your story, your existence, your voice are yours to guard, and there is no greater justice than surviving and living well in the aftermath of someone else's attempt to erase you.